My name is Charles Stephen Hine. I've always gone by my middle name of Stephen, P-H-E-N, because my dad named me after his brother Charles, and that wasn't a very good choice, so I've always gone by Stephen my entire life. I've never been married. I was born on February 4th, 1951, and I feel like it's been a very interesting life. Last year when I turned 70, I bought a t-shirt that says, "I survived the 60s twice." Part of what happened to me in the 60s is when I began falconry. In 1964, on the way to public middle school in Boulder, Colorado, I was riding with my mother to school when I was in that 8th grade. A 9th grader was chasing down a goshawk that was being chased by a dog around in the field. I think the dog and the goshawk were fighting over what the goshawk had caught to eat. So anyway, he knew what he was doing because he had read Frederick II's book, and he got the goshawk to turn over on its back. I got out of the car. My mother took everybody else to school. He sent me to the barn to get 2 feed sacks. We rolled one of them up, got the goshawk to grab it, lifted the goshawk up, put it in the other feed sack. My mother came by, and we took it to his house, and he had a parrot cage that we put it in the parrot cage and then covered it in the breezeway between his dad's office and the garage. When we got home from school, it was Friday night, we started training the bird, and by the next morning, we already had the bird setting on the fist on Saturday morning and eating off the fist. It was a passage goshawk, not a haggard. And we had it 4 weeks, and we trained it to fly back and forth between the two of us. And then we were getting ready to go hawking when I had to make the first adult decision of my life at 13 years old. And that was the decision of that the go-kart frame was all welded up or the goshawk, because David's wife said, David's father said that either the go-kart or the goshawk, not both. So on Sunday morning, we flew it back and forth, 4 weeks later, back and forth, and it flew from his house over a mile away and landed in my backyard. And I said, "You do the go-kart, I'll do the goshawk," but I couldn't get it back. But the die was cast, I was wedded. We learned about falconry from Larry Crowley, who did falconry with, he wrote the Constitution of Sudan, Mavro Godardo. And so he was a very good falconer to be apprenticed under long before the apprentice program was fully accepted around the United States. So learned about falconry. In 1968, from the central director of NAFA, Dr. Frank Serra, I inherited a red-tailed hawk from the Kansas City Zoo, 2 kestrels, and a roadside hawk that is native to Mexico. And so I went from no hawks to 2 mini hawks very quickly, and flew the red-tailed at rabbits, flew the kestrels at a bird feeder with English starlings at it. My sister was flying the female kestrel, and it got caught in her hair, and then she said that was enough of that. She didn't want to do it. So I continued to fly both of the kestrels till I lost them flying them as starlings. They flew off. This is pre-telemetry, so this would be in the fall of 1968 and the spring of 1969. I graduated high school in 1969, went on my senior trip to Colorado, took the red tail with me, and flew rabbits and jackrabbits in eastern Colorado, around Fort Collins, Colorado, and Boulder, Colorado. That was the beginning. The die was cast. I was quite successful with red tail. When I went away to college, Dr. Starr had given me a European goshawk to fly, so I had the red tail and the European goshawk, and was flying both of them. And I was flying the goshawk on a corner lot in Manhattan, Kansas, which is where K-State is. And a young man from Venezuela saw me flying and found out he was trying to get started in falconry. His sister had bought him a kestrel at a pet shop. In Kansas, falconry went from where they were paying bounty on accipiter and owl feet to where it was fully protected. This was at the time where there was no protection for raptors in Kansas at all. So that's what had happened, how he ended up with the kestrel. So he was having trouble with success with the kestrel, met me, and we paired up, and we did falconry together for from 1971 to 1976. We ended up coming up with a Harris hawk, Passage Harris hawk, and we flew the Passage Harris hawk in cast with the red tail, taught them to where not to attack each other on a creance first before we ever flew them loose, and they learned to hunt together in a true cast like a wingman and a wing leader. The red tail would come in high and the Harris hawk would come in low, and not very many rabbits could get away from the team of them. Also, his name was Valdemar Romer. He just passed from COVID this spring of 2022. His sister at that time had bought a Labrador Retriever, and with the Labrador we made it part of the team. And between the two of us, the Labrador, the red tail, and the Harris hawk, we were catching any rabbit we flushed almost, which meant we took it from like 12 or 20% that you catch up to almost 100% of what we were catching. So we had to be careful not to catch too much. Moving on, he went back to Venezuela. I went to work as a land surveyor, which is a doctor of land. I measure land to make house lots, set grades on sanitary sewers, build and locate streets and get the grades right so they don't flood or they drain correctly, put in storm drains, etc. I am the only person in my household that took up falconry. I have never married. I have been with women one at a time with the intention of marrying them, and it just never quite worked out, maybe because of the falconry. I did not have any introduction to falconry prior to the goshawk that happened on the way to school in 1964. That was my introduction to falconry. In the mid-70s, I started flying various and sundry other birds. I flew, the roadside hawk was a lot of fun, and I gave it to another falconer. It was quite a character. I don't think it was really very aggressive. He was going to try to fly starlings with it, and it was still a lot of trouble to get it to fly starlings even. They're a small buteo, very interesting hawk, very smart, but not very aggressive. Excuse me. I would say in my life, falconry is not an avocation, but it's more than a hobby. Does it define me as a person? Pretty much so, probably. In many respects, it does define what I hold important. Environmental issues, all sorts of things based around the world that I have committed myself to with falconry because I enjoy it so much. None of my rest of my family has picked it up. The falconry, my family actually didn't understand my interest in falconry, my mother and dad especially. I was very foreign to their way of thinking of life, where you're supposed to marry and have a family and go to work, and falconry didn't fit into that scenario very well because of the amount of time it takes to do falconry correctly. In 1974, falconry became illegal in Kansas because it had to come under federal, United States of America federal requirements, and Kansas elected not to meet those requirements because they didn't think there was enough people interested in falconry in the state of Kansas to make it financially worthwhile for the Department of Conservation to make it legal. So I had to move to practice falconry, so I moved to central Missouri. That was a good move. There was a lot of captive breeding going on. There was research work doing with bird of prey. There was connections that I got to make. I got to travel with falconry to other places. I got to see other wildlife situations with raptors. all by connections with people I met through the university. What happened after I moved is that the red tail I had a problem that went to the veterinarian to the University of Missouri, and that when they sedated my bird, they used Valium and ketamine and killed my bird with a sedative. I was very upset, but within a year I was given another red-tailed hawk that was another hand-me-down. I believe that when you take it was an IS taken out of Fort Knox, Kentucky by 3 military officers, and actually the waitress in the military officers club had named the hawk after the Turkish word buka, which means mean, nasty, craggy woman. So anyway, she had quite a history. When I got her, all that was past because she was already a 1971 IS, so that would make her about 13 years old when I got her. So she was an old lady, but had settled down quite a bit. The thing about her is she had spent a lot of time with the officer that took her out of the wild in Waco, Texas, and she had learned to take jackrabbits and handle them quite well. And catching jackrabbits with a red tail is a lot of fun. So I had a lot of fun with her. I got her to live for 33 years. She died in the summer of 2005 of old age, and I was flying her 3 or 4 days before she died. She was good to me, I was good to her. Like I said, she was just not only a lot of fun on rabbits, she also, in Missouri we have these red fox squirrels that are huge. She was pretty good with them. I didn't like to catch squirrels because they bite, and I didn't want to get her hurt. So the choice when we caught a squirrel, she made that choice, not me. Because they're available at the time when we were hunting cottontail rabbits. Quit saying The sacrifices I've made because of falconry might be in career, in time that was dedicated to a family, but the plus side of it is I've gotten to go places and meet people that would only happen through the connections I had made with falconry. My first falconry meet was a NAFA meet in 1971, and actually I was already mad because there was a famous falconer that had been all over the world. His name was Corny McFadden, and he had passed in the year between the 1970 NAFA meet, which he was at, and the 1971 meet, so I didn't get to meet him. But from 1971, there was no falconry meet in 1972, and ever since then I've been at every NAFA meet except 2 of them recently. So it's been also a good excuse to get together with other falconry people and have a good time flying together and seeing what they are doing and what I am doing and compare the two. Something happened in the mid-70s connected with the university that is closely related to falconry, which is captive breeding. I was given by another captive breeder in Columbia, Missouri, a pair of Harris hawks, and they were both Passage Harris hawks, and somebody said, oh, you can't get them to breed. Well, the biggest thing with putting them together was not that they were going to hurt each other, but they were very disappointed with all the nest situations that I kept giving to them. I tried to help them build a nest and everything. It worked out that a wire in a fork of a tree in the aviary didn't work. Filled it with sticks, filled it with brush, filled it. So I put in a bushel apple basket, and that was what suited them. And as soon as I put it in there, they laid eggs. With that pair of Harris hawks between 1977, I got 1 young bird in 77. The most I ever produced in 1 year was 3 years in a row. I produced 3 clutches of Harris hawks in 1980 1981, I produced 12. 1982, I produced 13. 1984, I produced 12. And there was so much work to feed them. And the way I did that is the imprint redtail built a nest behind the perch in her shelter, which was built like a doghouse on stilts with the side open and with the perch running horizontal across the broad side of it. And behind that perch, she would build the nest behind it. And actually, when she'd get in the nest with her, her eggs that she laid, she would take the leash in her mouth and put it over the perch and put it in the nest with her. And so, with the way the Harris Hawks worked, is I would pull the clutch and put it in the incubator, and then they would lay another clutch. And when the clutch in the incubator had hatched, I'd put the ones that the Harris Hawks had just laid in the incubator and put that clutch underneath the red tail. And then the next clutch, when the ones in the incubator would hatch, I'd give that second clutch to the Harris Hawks in the garage to raise. And the third clutch would hatch in the incubator, and I would switch out the older birds underneath the red tail for the younger birds and get the third clutch to be raised by the red tail. The thing about the red tail is it was not in an aviary or an enclosure. It was on a leash, loose to the open. So I would come home from work at 5 o'clock in the evening, and the red tail would be on top of the doghouse on stilts. There was a perch on top, screaming bloody murder, and there was no Harris Hawks to be seen. So I would wait for dark and shine a flashlight out there and then see all these little eyes underneath the red tail and go out and pick out the Harris Hawks one at a time and bring them in the house and dress them up and leash them. And then the people who had range to come and get them would have to come and get them in the next closest weekend. So when I go to get them, I believe through Edmund Burt's Hawks and Hawking book that the first 3 days is very important with the bird of prey for falconry. So I would go ahead and start training them too, till the people that were due to come get them got there to pick up their bird. It made for very good Harris Hawks. One of the things that came out of this is that I sent 6 Harris Hawks to a captive breeder in Reno, Nevada, and the 2 captive breeders in Reno, Nevada sent them to England. So I think some of the bloodlines to my Harris Hawks are all over England and the European Union as well through their bloodlines, because I know at least 3 sets of Harris Hawks were set up with one or the other be a part of my Harris Hawks. Anyway, there was about 110 eggs, about 80 some young that one pair of Harris Hawks were raised, and she quit raising good eggs, laying good eggs in 1993, and she passed in 98. And I got the male Harris Hawk to live to 33 as well. She was called the Queen of Hearts. He was called the Ace of Spades because at the time when they were taken, they were just named after cards in a deck of cards. In the 70s, I also started flying falcons. I cut my teeth on Passage prairie falcons caught in the west of Kansas, and then okay, we're all right. Passage prairie falcons caught in Kansas, which was a lot of fun and a good way to get started with a large falcon and do a good job of it. Part of the people that I grew up in falconry, before it became illegal to go to Padre Island, Texas, would catch peregrines. So I got to go hawking with them with Passage peregrines and learn from the best of how to fly a long wing. We had a lot of fun with the Passage peregrines, flying them without telemetry, and usually flying them till we lost them back to the wild that following spring. Don't believe we had 2 sets of 3 that they flew, and I don't think that any of them got kept through a molt. They all were turned back loose to the wild. So anyway, it was a good way to cut my teeth on falcons, was with Passage falcons. In 1978, I was given an itis undersized female prairie falcon, and I had a really good time with her. And she was small for a female, but she had the face of a female. And falconry with her was just a lot of fun, very successful. Okay, moving on. Let's move up to 1984 is when I inherited Buka, the red tail that I was telling you about. I was still flying. Every now and then I would fly a goshawk for a while, and usually I trapped it and then gave it away. I really enjoyed training new hawks. Trying to think here. I know you're going to be able to edit this, right? Yeah, okay. So, to me, every bird of prey is an individual, and as far as best and worst, it just depends on the luck of the draw. Sometimes it depends on the training if you messed something up and didn't get it done correctly. That, in my falconry, it was more about the psyche of the bird than it was whether or not it was managed correctly or not. As far as you know, mismanagement of a bird of prey where it got hurt, i.e. the way I kept it, the way I handled it. I've had some close calls. I had a prairie falcon land on a 3-phase high tension wire and got shocked and got all the way to the ground. And when I went over to pick it up the body, it was fine, a little dizzy and stuff. But what it did is for that particular prairie falcon, it never landed on a power pole ever again. I was flying a peregrine, a homing pigeon that we were using for mounting up exercises. The homing pigeon in front of the peregrine flew through a power line and hit it so hard it cut the pigeon in half, and the peregrine pulled out of the stoop and hovered down to the ground and tried to put the pigeon back together. It couldn't understand what happened. So both of these are examples of incidents of electrocution and collisions with power lines. So moving on, I had one peregrine that you only hope to get once in a lifetime, and I got it. She came out of Tony Robertson out of California, and evidently they would hatch these birds on their kitchen table, and when they were 7 days old, give them back to the parent birds. And this bird was, I like getting a bird of prey, if it's an eyas, at fledging, not at hard pinning, but within a week of fledging, but not the day of fledging. It needs to get from when it leaves the eyrie or the ledge in an aviary and be able to fly back and get back to it. And we've learned through science that's called nest site imprinting. That's what they learn what home is. And when you think about it, even with a human, you have to leave home and come back to it and look at it to know what home looks like. So that's very important, I think, to a captive bird of prey to be able to be with its parents to fledge. After that, in an aviary, everything in that bird says, I need to learn to fly, I need to learn to fly, and you've got to take it out of the aviary. And then actually the 5-week window that Oliphant talks about in Canada is right up the alley, I believe, is as soon as you can get the bird tame enough to know that you're not going to lose it, that you need to get it in a situation where it can teach itself to fly and learn its skill set that it has to learn to do flight correctly. So anyway, everything went so perfect with this peregrine that when I started catching ducks with it, it was so good that it would take a duck a day. And there was a piece of the University of Missouri experimental research farm that was connected to the beef science research that had 11 ponds in a row. And these ponds would have ducks on it. And this particular peregrine would go from one pond to the other to pick the pond that had ducks on it, and it picked the pond that it wanted to fly the ducks on. And when it would pick that pond, it would start ringing up over that pond and all I had to do was drive in my automobile to keep up with the peregrine till it picked the pond, and then stop my vehicle and turn it off and get out and wait for her to mount up to height, and then get out and flush a duck, and we would catch a duck. I could do all this in a lunch hour. From 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock, I would get something to eat, take the peregrine, go fly it, catch a duck, give the peregrine the head and the neck. It would eat it on the way back to work. Excuse me. Put the hood on the peregrine, and it would wait for me to finish work. And then we would go home. One of the things I learned from this peregrine, at 4 years of age, highly successful in life, it was still learning to fly. One day at the first pond at South Farm, the University Beef Research Farm, it started ringing up next to a pond in a thermal with a bunch of, in America they're called turkey vultures, big black vultures that are pretty large. I said, oh, she's going to go up and play tag with the turkey vultures. Well, what it was a very strong circular updraft that she figured out the turkey vultures were in, and she got into it and started ringing up in really tight circles to stay in the thermal, maybe only 300, 200 feet from the edge of the pond, and was ringing, and the pond had ducks on it. It was ringing up and up and up and up, and I said, let's just wait and see what happens. And she got up to the top, and then she started practicing wing overs to start to stoop. She tried upwind, she tried downwind, side wind left, side wind right, and then she went to the downwind side of the thermal and turned into the wind, winged over real quick, started on the way down to the pond, and I hustled down the pond, flushed the ducks, and she walloped one right proper, and from then on she would wing over into the wind to get a snap on the wing over at the top of the stoop. And so at 4 years of old age, this bird was still trying to teach itself how to fly, which means humans stuck to the ground just can't quite do the instruction for a bird of prey to learn to fly correctly without lots of time involved in doing it. I've never messed with other birds, keeping them as pets, other than as a kid. Had a cage, 1958, as a family we bought a cage parakeet, and we had that for 13 years. Took it to Dr. Frank Serra, which was the central director of NAFA, to his veterinary shop, and he says, I can't believe these things have a lifespan of 3 or 4 years. You got it to 13 years. He couldn't believe it lasted that long. And then we had later on had a cockatiel and taught it to talk, but that got moved on from one family member to another. So that was dogs. I've had some fantastic dogs in my life. There's a rock and roll song about inheriting a dog named Jack. I inherited a Brittany named Jack, and what it did for me is I learned to hate male dogs. I only like to fly over female dogs because the male dogs always have other interests on their mind, it seems, and other than cooperating with the falconry situation. It's so much more complicated than a regular bird dog, you know, pointing for gun hunters, that the dog has to be in a whole lot better control and has to actually know what's going on. I've had dogs that knew falconry so well that it would tell me when to come in to flush. The best dog I ever had was a red setter, which is not an Irish red setter by AKC standards, but the European red setter that they have recreated in the United States, which is shorter haired, smaller dog, and very intelligent. This dog, when it would go on point, and I would unhood the peregrine and turn it loose, and it would go up. When the peregrine got to pitch, it was in the right position, the dog would slowly turn its head and look at me, and then actually wag its head at me to say, come on, it's time to flush, everything's ready to go, let's do this. So the dog actually knew the situation well enough for the falcon and the dog to be successful to catch what we were flying. Flying, one of the most interesting things I do every year, except this year. This is the first year in 22 years I've missed traveling 1,200 miles from central Missouri to southwestern Wyoming to sage-grouse hawk in some of the best sage-grouse country in the world. And the thing that's really neat about sage-grouse is they don't run in front of the dog like a pheasant. When the dog gets